Hello everybody, and welcome to day 13 of 28 days to better chess tactics. Today is actually part 2 of the 34 checkmate patterns in total that we're looking at, and this will cover the other 17. So in day 12 we covered 17, today we'll cover the other 17, which actually are a little more complicated and pretty cool. Today, right now, the position we have up here is Greco's mate. So this position with white to move is basically with the bishop covering this square, a pawn or some type of piece. Well, normally it's a pawn, and then the queen or rook delivering checkmate along the Hfile, or it could be, the file or rank, but here it's the Hfile. So we go queen to H5, we can go queen to H4, queen to H3. But either way, it's checkmate because this escape square is covered by the bishop. Now, this is a very common checkmate pattern when you're attacking the king, and a lot of times it's a sacrifice on H7 with the rook or some other type of piece. So you'll notice this in your own games or happening to you when you play enough games. This position here, position 19, is the Hfile mate, which obviously is on the Hfile, and normally it's with a rook. Let's go to the analysis board here. Let me adjust that. It's with a rook and a bishop. So you can see the dark square bishop is cutting along this entire diagonal and controlling this square. Now you can see, well, I added a rook and a bishop here just to make it more realistic, but after rook to H8, because this bishop is supporting the rook as well as cutting off the escape square, then it's checkmate. This also illustrates the power of the bishop because it's a long-range piece. It can cut across the whole board, and it's one of the reasons a bishop is stronger than a knight. Alright, moving on to position 20. Position 20 is called the hook mate. And it's called that because the knight covering the square that supports the rook is kind of like a hook coming in to deliver the final checkmate. Now, it could be a rook or a queen, but the characteristic is a pawn supporting a knight, which supports a heavy piece that delivers a checkmate. You can see the pawn is essential because it's covering this square, and the knight is covering this square. So the final checkmate is rook to E8 checkmate. Now notice that the checkmate happens in the center of the board here, and this kind of checkmate does happen in the center of the board when the black king doesn't castle or is stuck through an attack in the center. Position 21 here is called the killbox mate, which you'll notice that the rook and the queen, it's white to move, form a box that they can force the king down, and as the king moves down, he'll be mated once he reaches the last rank or the last file. Now, this checkmate can be performed either this way or down the board. So you'll notice that even though black has a material advantage with two queens and a rook, white doesn't need to take this rook because as these pieces intersect on the dark squares, white will checkmate on the light squares, and there's nothing that black can do about it. So the checkmate goes rook check, queen check, and then rook check and mate. Position 22 here is the king and two bishops mate. It's one of the 4 basic checkmates that you should know and are covered in these 2-part series. So pretty much the only difference between this and the two bishops mate is that instead of a pawn controlling the escape square, it's the king, the white king specifically. And so the checkmate is just bishop to F6, and you'll see because the two bishops are controlling all these squares and the king's controlling this square, it's checkmate. Alright, position 23 is the two knights mate. Now this mating pattern can only happen if the opponent makes a mistake. There's no way to actually force black. But you can see here that white can checkmate with knight to G6, and the other knight, this knight, is covering these 2 squares. Now, the mistake that black made was probably he was in check on the previous move, and instead of moving away from the king, he moved to the incorrect square. So in these types of positions, if there's two knights versus a king, you can actually just forcibly prevent every checkmate as long as you try to stay in the center and away from the corners. So that's just something to keep in mind if you're defending this position. Position 24 here is known as Legal's mate, and it arises from the opening when the two knights checkmate the king in the open board. Now, because the two knights, or this knight specifically, supports the bishop controlling this square as well as this square, once the knight comes to d5, then it's actually checkmate. Now, this only arises in the opening because black's pieces, namely the bishop and the queen, are undeveloped and prevent black from having those escape squares. Position 25 is lolis mating pattern, and it's just when the pawn supports the queen in this pawn formation of black to checkmate the black king with queen to g7. This checkmate is known as Max Lang's checkmate, and now I set up a position that is a couple moves before, and so you'll see it at the end, but it's basically the bishop and the queen delivering checkmate. Now, the queen supports this square, so we kind of have to do a bishop check here, and then we have a discovered check with the bishop, which now the bishop controls this square, and we could bring our queen in to deliver the final checkmate. Position 27 here is known as Polemorphe's mate. If we go back a move, we can see that the characteristic is the rook cutting off the king and the bishop delivering the final checkmate with bishop to f6. Position 28 is similar to the Hfile mate, but this is actually called the opera mate, again inspired by Polemorphe, because he delivered this famous checkmate in his Opera House game that I covered in my 1-minute Master Game series. And it's the same features as the Hfile mate because the bishop is supporting the rook, delivering final checkmate on d8. Position 29 is known as Pillsbury's mate, and it's similar to Morphe's mate, but it's basically a Morphe's mate by force. And so it comes about when the rook takes on g7 check, and now there's a discovered check with the bishop and the rook. And because this pawn prevents black from having an escape square, the rook has to give itself up, and you checkmate with the bishop. This is the queen's mate, one of the 4 basic checkmates you need to know, and pretty much it's just queen to d7 checkmate with the king supporting. Now, you need to be careful about this formation, because if it wasn't black to move, it would be stalemate otherwise. Position 31 here is known as Reddys mate, because this is a checkmate pattern that Reddy delivered against, I think it's Tartakower or Tarash, in only 9 moves. So this isn't the exact pattern, of course, but it goes with the rook covering this square and the bishop delivering checkmate on d1, cutting through this diagonal. Position 32 here is known as the Smothered mate, and it actually happens a lot more often than you would think. So the Smothered mate is basically when you use the knight to deliver a checkmate by closing in the king. So I've chosen the most complicated type of pattern you'll see, and it's a 3-move combination that starts with a double check, the knight, and the queen. Now, of course, if the queen or if the king moves here, we just have queen to f7 checkmate. So that's actually a 2-move sequence. But if black makes it hard on us and goes king to h8, of course we could repeat, but we just get the same position. Now, white sacrifices his queen, forcing the rook to take because the knight's covering that square. And once the rook takes, the knight goes to f7, and because the rook is covering this escape square, we checkmate the king. And it's known as a smothered mate, of course, because all of black's pieces are smothering him, and the knight to f7 cannot be defended against. Position 33 is called the suffocation mate, and it's basically a knight delivering a checkmate when the bishop is cutting off the escape squares of the king, either here or here. Now, the knight in this position goes to e7, checkmate, but he could also be over here delivering checkmate on the h6 square. The 34th and last position here is called the Swallowtail mate, and well, I'm not sure why it's called that, but it's similar to the epaulette mate with these two rooks cutting off the king, having an escape square, and of course the queen's supported by the rook, so we just go queen to e6 and it's checkmate. Alright, so it looks like we made it through all the checkmate patterns. If you want, leave a comment, let me know what you think. Subscribe if you want to follow along, and I just want to have a reminder to hit the notification button if you want to follow along, otherwise you won't get notified of my videos. Thanks for watching.